Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Some breaking news in the last hour. The Conservative MP Stephen Phillips has announced that he's standing down as an MP with immediate effect. He says it's because of, quote, irreconcilable policy differences with the government. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Ian Watson. Ian, talk us through this. Stephen Phillips, a Lincolnshire MP, Sleaford and North Wycombe. As I understand it, he was a Leaver. He's on the side of Brexit. So what are these irreconcilable policy differences?
That's right, Andrew. He was a Leaver in common with the vast majority of his constituents in Lincolnshire. But what he's been saying, I've been talking to him over the past few weeks or so, is that people voted to leave, but they didn't vote for a specific form of leave. So while he was in favour of bringing parliamentary sovereignty back to this country, repatriating laws from Brussels to Britain, he's not in favour of doing what he saw as potential economic damage to this country by leaving the single market. So he's pro-leave, but not pro-leaving the single market. And he was worried about what he was talking about as a hard Brexit. He thought the rhetoric coming out of government was leading in that direction. In addition to that, he was also worried about the lack of parliamentary scrutinies he saw. Not just this question about whether MPs get a vote on triggering Article 50, but also he wanted to get more detail from the government about what type of Brexit they wanted, what the negotiating stance would be, and he was increasingly frustrated. It is strange, though, that he's gone at this stage before the matter is settled in the Supreme Court. They're obviously hearing the government's appeal next month. And it's also interesting in his statement that he's talked about significant and growing differences with the government, because I've been looking at his voting record, Andrew, on other issues, and actually he's largely been incredibly loyal, except on the issue of the form that Brexit should take. And of course, he was speaking in this programme very recently about his views on Article 50 and how Parliament should handle it.
Parliament's, here to serve the will of the people, and the will of the British people is very clear. The majority of them wanted to leave the European Union. But what is not clear is what the British people wanted in terms of the Brexit that the government is going to negotiate. And that's why the government has to come here to this sovereign body and ask parliamentarians on behalf of their constituents what form our future relationship with the European Union should take.
Well, that was Stephen Phillips, Ian, the departing MP. He's now triggered a by-election there, but it's an incredibly safe Conservative seat. He got 56% of the vote in 2015. Labour was second with 17% of the vote. He had a 24,000 majority. Who will really be the challenger? Labour was second, but UKIP was a pretty close third. I mean, in a way, first of all, do we know when this by-election will be? And secondly, could this be good news for the government? They'll almost certainly in Lincolnshire pick a hardline Brexiteer, and the main challenger may well be UKIP rather than Labour.
Well, that's absolutely right, Andrew. You have to ask, who does it benefit that Stephen Phillips is going? He's a very successful QC. He may have been able to help hold the government to account had he stayed in position. He says his resignation is with immediate effect. As you know, you have to go through the parliamentary process, apply for the Chiltern Hundreds or whatever. So we're not quite sure when the by-election would be. But in that by-election, as you were saying, it'd be very surprising if Theresa May wasn't able to get somebody who's absolutely in line with her views. And given the nature of the constituency and the strong Leave vote in that area, it would be surprising if you get anyone who is critical of Brexit being selected by the Conservatives either. They've got a huge majority, and given the current state of the Labour Party, 14 points behind the Conservatives at the moment in the national polls, then possibly, actually, it's not impossible that they may do worse than they did at the general election. So therefore, Theresa May feel strengthened by Stephen Phillips' resignation and get somebody more in line with their views and less critical in place. And all eyes will be on UKIP, of course, because this could be the first test, potentially, of the new UKIP leader to see whether they can come from third to second place. But it would be a major upset if they were to come first and overturn a majority of around 25,000.
Just to clarify one thing very briefly, Ian, no suggestion that Mr Phillips is going to stand as an independent. He's not going to do a Zach Goldsmith, is that right?
I think that's right, yes. He's certainly refusing to do any further interviews today, but it doesn't sound like he's doing a Zach Goldsmith, or indeed actually not that far away from his constituency too. David Davis, once upon a time, who of course resigned and then re-stood in his seat against David Cameron's view on civil liberties.
Very well. Thank you very much, Ian, for that. I'm not quite sure what the political significance of the. I mean, we're talking about an MP that most of the country's never heard of, and he's a very wealthy QC. I think he once said his constituents were lucky to have him. Now they don't. What's the significance?
Well, he's an interesting character. Back in 2013, he said he would quit as a Tory MP if David Cameron failed to deliver on the EU referendum. And as you said, he voted leave, but clearly quite a niche view, because he obviously was one of the few soft Brexiteers pre the June referendum. You know, the Tories look likely to take this seat. They're clearly going to stand again. I do think that Labour-UKIP battle will be really interesting, because with the court judgment yesterday, UKIP really have an opportunity here to say, are people trying to scupper the view, the will of the people? And if so, maybe they should try and make that stance in a by-election like this.
And keep their feet to the fire, sort of thing. The timing is nevertheless still strange. I mean, if he's not saying anything else, we can only but speculate. Because he got this court ruling, I don't know if he didn't get it personally, but the court ruling came, which plays to his agenda.
Exactly.
He wants to leave, but he thinks it should be done by a parliamentary process. So what, I could see him resigning if the High Court had said, nope, the government can do what it wants, it doesn't need to consult Parliament. So baffled we are.
I think with all political resignations, when they go, they try and have some sort of, they try and grab some headlines when they go, you know, use your resignation well. Speaking to Tory backbenchers earlier today, they think there are more factors behind this resignation. One, that he was overlooked in Theresa May's first cabinet, or the junior minister post. Scorned.
Politicians?
A scorned politician, like the likes of Nicky Morgan, Anna Soubry, perhaps. He is seen as eminently capable. He's a QC, as a barrister, very highly paid barrister.
At one stage he was the highest?
He earned £750,000 in 2012, and there was a lot of publicity around that.
Yeah, but you wouldn't take a pay cut to do that.
No. No, exactly. But no, I think there's more.
He's gone back to spend more time with his money.
Yeah, there's more to this.
I think he's trying to make a statement as well, and there may be something on refugees as well.
But it's
maybe
not,
another issue.
There may be another.
But it's not good for Theresa May's government. We understand they weren't aware this was coming. It only adds to that sense of momentum about a general election.
It does add to the sense that when you go to bed at night, you have no idea what you're going to wake up to in the morning, or even in the middle of the night.
A Conservative MP has resigned today over the government's handling of Brexit, saying he doesn't want to represent a UKIP-light platform. Friends of Stephen Phillips, who backed leave in the referendum, said he thinks the values of the Conservative Party have changed. It comes as Theresa May has been speaking to European leaders to tell them that her plans for leaving Europe are still on track. Well, let's cross to Westminster now and speak to our senior political correspondent, Jason Farrell. So how much of a blow for the Prime Minister is this resignation?
Well, I think it is a blow for Theresa May on a number of accounts. Stephen Phillips, first of all, is someone who backed her in her bid for leadership. Secondly, he is someone who voted for out, but is here saying that he disagrees with the process in which the government is going through. And I think that's significant, because a lot of people who say that Parliament shouldn't have a vote say that the concern is that Parliament would overrule the democratic decision made under the referendum. But here is someone who supports the decision under the referendum, but disagrees in which the process that the government is carrying out. And he also expresses other concerns about Theresa May's leadership and the way the government is going, talking about it being UKIP light. So let's have a look at the statement he's given. He says, "It has become clear to me over the last few months that my growing and very significant policy differences with the current government mean that I am unable to properly represent the people who elected me. This decision has been a difficult one, and I hope that everyone will respect the fact that I have tried to act in the best interests of my constituents." And the other problem, of course, for Theresa May is that means, following Zach Goldsmith's resignation over Heathrow and triggering a by-election there, she now has another by-election to contend with.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister's been speaking to European leaders today, attempting to reassure them. What she had to say?
Well, this is interesting too, because Theresa May has called up the EU Commissioner President, Jean-Claude Juncker, this morning, as well as the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and said to both of them that although she is disappointed with the result in the High Court, she's confident that the government can win in the Supreme Court. And that gives them the confidence to say that the timetable in which they've set for triggering Article 50 of the end of March will be kept. But what's interesting is that that all seems to be dependent on the confidence they have of winning in the Supreme Court. What we couldn't get out of the Prime Minister's spokesperson today when they met journalists earlier was whether, if they lost in the Supreme Court, that means that they had a contingency that would still be able to allow them to trigger Article 50 by the end of March. That wasn't clear from the government. And we do get the sense from talking to other MPs that there would be efforts to try to perhaps slow things down a little bit, to try and get more reassurance from the government on the kind of deal they are going to negotiate. Let's hear from Tim Farron, from the leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Parliament being sovereign on behalf of the people, which is right, absolutely right, it's what people on the Leave side said they were campaigning for last June. That provides us with an opportunity to amend the bill when it comes to Parliament so that we have a referendum on the deal. You must not end this process with a stitch-up, and it absolutely beggars belief that people like Nigel Farage should want to put their trust in Brussels bureaucrats, because that is who is going to write the deal that Britain will have to live with unless the British people have their say.
I was talking to Ian Duncan-Smith, one of the key Brexiteers in the campaign. He says his problem is that obviously power was handed over to the people in the referendum to make this decision on whether to stay in the EU. And his issue is if you hand it back to Parliament and they disagree, a lot of MPs say they wouldn't disagree, they would respect the result. But if they disagreed and Parliament voted against triggering Article 50, he said that could trigger a constitutional crisis. And indeed, if that did happen, it does seem that a snap election could well follow.
Jason Farrell, thank you. A former police superintendent has been found guilty of 4 child sex abuse charges after decades protesting his innocence. 79-year-old Gordon Anglesey, who had a long police career in North Wales, abused his position to sexually assault vulnerable young boys around Wrexham in the 1980s. 2 victims described in court how Anglesey had abused them as teenagers. He's been sentenced to 12 years in jail. As the fallout from Brexit continues, Boris Johnson has been on the charm offensive in Berlin today. At his first bilateral talks with his German counterpart, the Foreign Secretary called on all EU member states to seize the opportunities of Brexit. However, his opposite number, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, was somewhat less positive. Here's what he had to say.
My preferred option wäre ein anderer Ausgang des britischen Referendums.
My preferred option would have been a different outcome of the British referendum. That would have been my preferred option.
But you will notice that Frank did not say that his preferred, because he's a very wise man, did not say that his preferred outcome would be another British referendum or an attempt to put the toothpaste back in the tube, or however you want to express it. We've taken a very clear decision in our country, and I think it's the right decision. It offers great opportunities for change and progress in the whole of the European region. I think we should be seizing those opportunities, and that's one of the points that I've been making to Frank-Walter today.
Theresa May has told the German Chancellor and the President of the European Commission that there's no change to her timetable for Britain leaving the EU. That's despite yesterday's High Court ruling that Parliament must have a say about when the process should begin. Downing Street said today the government was confident of winning its appeal against the decision in the Supreme Court and of triggering the Brexit process by the end of March. The government's attempts to reassure came as the pro-Leave Conservative MP Stephen Phillips resigned because of what he called irreconcilable policy differences with the government over Brexit. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar.
Is Brexit still on track, Mr Johnson?
A new day, and getting out of the EU hasn't got any easier.
Is Brexit on track, sir?
Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson saved his answer till he got to Berlin on a visit today. But that answer was Brexit would stay on track.
The British people voted to leave the European Union, leave the treaties of the European Union, and that is what we are going to get on and do.
Theresa May's phoned EU leaders, like the EU Commission head, Jean-Claude Juncker, saying she's confident of winning a Supreme Court appeal to regain the right to decide when and how to start talks on Brexit. Today's big surprise, though, Tory MP Stephen Phillips resigned his safe Tory seat to force a by-election, blaming irreconcilable differences with the government. He's a Leave supporter, but wants more say for Parliament and Britain to stay in the EU single market. The temperature's risen, and the papers have gone to war against the judges who ruled against the government, against the defeated Remain campaigners they say want to defy the will of the people in the June referendum. How did we get here? The judges ruled that since Parliament took Britain in, only Parliament can take Britain out. And now it's about politics. Leave-siders who argued for British law with British judges and made by British MPs are worried those MPs may use that power to delay or even block Brexit. And the pro-Europeans are piling on the pressure.
If the government were to pursue a very hard Brexit approach, which I judge and other MPs judge to be not in the national interest, then I would vote against that and say, go back to the drawing board, come up with a better approach to Brexit, and then bring it back to Parliament.
Suddenly, MPs have got more clout than they imagined, and after a Leave campaign to take back control, ministers have lost control of Britain's EU exit. As it stands, there'll be votes and they'll count. No MPs are saying they'll vote to block Brexit. Too many people voted for it, but a reckoning's coming between MPs who want more detail of the government's negotiating position and more give and take in the talks. On the other side, the government, who want a free hand to cut migration and no more EU contributions. In the Lords, pro-EU peers could stall a law triggering talks for over a year. Ministers and their supporters are getting ready for the battle for Brexit.
What this is about is allowing a die-hard group of Remain campaigners who have not made their peace with the referendum verdict, the verdict to the British people, give them the opportunity to delay, frustrate or hold the government to ransom. And that is not what the country needs right now.
MPs and peers will keep their say over Britain's EU exit unless the Supreme Court says no next month. A struggle between government and Parliament could take months, years, and though the Prime Minister is still saying she won't call an early election, Prime Ministers can always find a good reason or a good excuse when they're convinced they'll win. This struggle may just give Theresa May both. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
So, what are people who voted in the referendum making of all this? Danny Savage has been to Barnsley, which voted in June for Britain to leave the EU.
The day after the referendum result in June, most voters in Barnsley were delighted.
I'm just glad we're out in it, and that's it for me, because this is our England.
A lot of men's fought for our country to remain British, and for me, I'm pretty happy with that information.
5 months on, what do they now make of the ruling that Parliament must vote on triggering Brexit talks? We caught up with Amber Roberts again.
Doesn't the people's vote matter? People have already voted, and it should be counted.
I feel as though there was no point in having a referendum.
Is that how you feel now?
It is, yeah.
Do you think it's still going to happen? Do you think Brexit will happen?
I think it should.
But you're not sure it will?
No, I'm not sure it will. I think they're wriggling out of it. They're wriggling out of it.
I mean, all they're saying really is that it's going to delay it. As long as Parliament gives it the OK, I think it'll be fine. And there's no reason that they shouldn't give it the OK.
So your ambitions for Brexit have not been derailed in the last 24 hours, you think?
No, I think they'll be slowed down a bit.
But there are people here who welcome yesterday's ruling.
I'm very much pro-Remain, and I feel that the latest situation is just being constitutionally done properly.
Like so many businesses in this area, European funding is their foundation. In the canteen, business owners are worried about the consequences of the ruling.
So you feel that if it goes through Parliament, the UK's hand will have to be shown of what it wants from Brexit?
I think that's the danger.
And you don't want that?
I don't want that. I want to give our team the best chance they can of getting the best deal for us, rather than showing what our hand is.
But like any good dinner table debate, opinions differ. Here's what one Remainer thinks.
We have people who are paid to represent us, to have all this information and make decisions on our behalf with a wealth of information at their hands and not focused on basically the tiny minutiae.
And that's MPs?
Exactly.
Back in town, its most famous son, cricket umpire Dickie Bird, is signalling out. It's what most people here want and still believe will happen. Danny Savage, BBC News, Barnsley.
Well, here the Brexit saga has taken another unexpected turn with the resignation of a pro-Leave Conservative MP who said he had irreconcilable policy differences with his party. You might think that Stephen Phillips wanted Britain's departure from the EU speeded up, but quite the opposite. He wanted the government to allow Parliament a greater say in the Brexit process. Michael Crick reports from his constituency in the Lincolnshire town of Sleaford.
Terms upon which the government are proposing to conduct negotiations.
Stephen Phillips last month telling MPs that while he'd voted for Brexit, Parliament must now have a say before the government applies for Article 50. The view taken by 3 top judges yesterday.
Now, the government has a mandate, as a result of the referendum, to take the UK out of the European Union. But what it doesn't have is a mandate as to the terms on which that should be done. Nearly half of those who voted did no substantive change at all in the relation between this country and the European Union. Their voices, although they did not chime with my own, appear entirely to have been forgotten in the rhetoric of hard Brexit, which has somehow become received wisdom on the part of the government.
A man who backed Theresa May in July now called her government tyrannical.
I didn't vote leave to see one tyranny which failed to consult this House, in the form of the European Commission, replaced by another, in the form of a government which fails to listen to what this House thinks about its negotiating position.
At his constituency party offices in Sleaford today, all seemed normal. Theresa May presiding over an ad for curry night with Stephen Phillips, and pictures of their now former MP on the wall.
What's your reaction to Mr. Phillips's resignation?
Disappointing. The fact we've got to have a by-election, which will take time, effort,
money,
but yet Stephen's done what he believes in, he's stood by his principles, and that's the end of the situation, really.
Well, yeah, I think he should pay £1 million to charity.
Why?
Because of all the expense of setting it back up. He shouldn't just leave like that.
So all the expense of a new election?
Yes, I do.
He's not going on the dole, is he?
You mean he's got a QC, well-paid barrister?
Yeah. I'd be more interested in what they're doing about these three judges what are wagging the dog.
Well, he's on their side on this one, I think, Mr. Phillips.
I'm not. I voted to come out of the EU, not to mess about. We should have come out the day after.
And following yesterday's big High Court judgment, Theresa May phoned Angela Merkel and the President of the European Commission today, assuring them the government's timetable for Brexit is unchanged. The Foreign Secretary, meeting his counterpart in Berlin, said much the same.
I think the direction is very clear. The will of the British people was expressed very clearly, and it's the decision of Theresa May and of her government to get on and make that process work.
So now this seat faces a by-election, probably before Christmas. As for the next general election, Downing Street insists that's still due in 2020.
Well, tonight the letter was published which Mr. Phillips sent to his constituency chairman explaining his irreconcilable differences. First, Brexit, as we know. Second, child refugees, where he feels this government is shirking its responsibilities. Third, international aid, where he's worried he thinks that aid is now going to people other than the world's poorest. And he ends his letter with dramatic words. Some will label me a quitter or no doubt worse, he wrote. Those are labels with which I can live. The label Conservative no longer is. It seems in recent weeks Mr. Phillips has become increasingly disillusioned with his government, his party and the direction this country is taking.
Michael Crick, thanks very much. Well, I'm joined now from Westminster by Suzanne Evans, one of the 3 candidates for the leadership of UKIP. Suzanne Evans, you said you think MPs should be allowed to sack judges, but you don't think they should be allowed to scrutinise plans to leave the EU.
We have a little bit of a dilemma here. It seems to me that this is a political decision on behalf of the judges and not a legal one, although I'm sure they have come forward with legal emphasis for it. My evidence is very simple. In the past, many Eurosceptics have attempted to take the government to court when they have tried to sign, well, when they have signed EU treaties, and they have been overruled on the basis that international treaties are a matter for royal prerogative. And now suddenly the boot is on the other foot, and we find that, oh no, it's not about royal prerogative. Parliament has to have a decision here. So I suggest that these judges are engaging in a little bit of judicial activism as opposed to actually making objective decisions.
I mean, basically, this is a decision you just don't like and you want it overturned. You'll be familiar with that argument from 16 million people who voted Remain.
I actually think it's quite the opposite. I think it's the Gina Miller who brought this case, who made it quite clear that she felt sick when she heard the result of the referendum. And now she's suddenly decided that she's developed a keen interest in the finer points of constitutional law. I think it is the 1,000 barristers, for instance, who wrote to David Cameron in the wake of the referendum saying that they was only advisory. You know, I think they're the the ones that are trying to influence here and trying to prevent Brexit.
We heard in Michael's piece about Stephen Phillips' resignation. You've been quick to say you'll stand in his seat. That is a brave move, given the shambles that UKIP has been over the last couple of months, isn't it?
We've just, as you know, we're in the middle of a leadership contest, and what's been really exciting for me is seeing the enthusiasm to take the party in a new direction at the hustings. We've had 2 hustings in London and in Newport in Wales, and members are really up for a fresh wind of change. They are really up to see the party going forward. Yes, we've had some troubles of late, but I'm absolutely confident. We have myself and Paul Nuttall, who are the 2 front runners in this race, and I know that both of us are going to work extremely hard to get the party back on an even footing. And I'm sure we have a very bright future ahead, and so do our members. Given
that Theresa May, as you and others have acknowledged, has promised to deliver on virtually all your key policies, Brexit, grammar schools, fracking, what is the point of UKIP now? Well, clearly she's not delivering, is she? Because she's got this problem. And I think actually the government's gone about this whole process of Brexit the wrong way. Article 50 is not, I think, the way to go about this in any case. It is a European Union construct. I think it will tie us up in legal knots, potentially for years to come. It would have been a much better government strategy to repeal the 1972 European Communities Act straight away. Then we do not have to deal with this kind of intrinsic detail. We simply have a vote in Parliament, and the MPs vote to repeal the Act. I think actually, given that the country voted leave, I think MPs will do the right thing. Suzanne Evans, thank you very much for joining us. Sorry to cut you off there.
Yesterday's High Court judgment that Parliament should vote on triggering Brexit negotiations with the rest of the EU has enraged Brexiteers and energised Remainers. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, said that respecting the judge's ruling would require, quote, an Act of Parliament approved by both Commons and Lords. His cabinet colleague, Sajid Javid, said that the court case was, quote, a clear attempt to frustrate the will of the British people. And for Labour, the Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry said that despite the ruling, Parliament will respect the will of the British people and vote for Article 50 to be triggered. For Labour, the Shadow Foreign Secretary repeated that. And then we had Baroness Wheatcroft. She's a Conservative peer. She was on the Daily Politics only a couple of weeks ago. She is a staunch Remainer, and she said there could be a majority in favour of delaying Article 50 in the Lords. Well, that would be interesting. But the Lib Dems, Nick Clegg, said that he wouldn't support triggering the Brexit process if the government is pursuing, quote, the most self-harming, hard version of Brexit. And Labour MP and former leadership contender Owen Smith thinks that the British people should have the final say on the real terms of Brexit. UKIP's interim leader, for it is Nigel Farage, he hasn't quite gone away, won't be impressed by that. He thinks the High Court ruling shows a great betrayal is underway. Now, there was no formal statement in the Commons on the High Court judgment yesterday, but MPs did raise the issue throughout the day. Here's a flavour of what they had to say, starting with the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, the government is disappointed by the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by Act of Parliament. The government is determined to respect the result of the referendum. This judgment raises important and complex matters of law, and it's right that we consider it carefully before deciding how to proceed.
The front bench has tried to suggest that the High Court decision that Parliament should have a vote before triggering Article 50 is in some way anti-democratic or thwarts the referendum result. Will he acknowledge that the vast majority of members in this House are now committed to honouring the decision to leave the EU, but that democracy demands that the terms of our leaving must be subject to the proper advanced scrutiny and consent of this democratically elected House, and not negotiated in secret and smuggled through without the support of this sovereign Parliament?
I think my right honourable friend said the government will be appealing. Could I ask him, on behalf of the government, please to look at the learned judge's ruling and understand that it's not about a rerun of the arguments about the EU referendum. It's all about Parliament's sovereignty.
Why should we fear a debate on a substantive motion? It would be a brave member of Parliament that voted against the will of the people. When it comes to Brexit, the only thing to fear is fear itself. Let's get on with it.
Well, that was some of the reaction to the judgment in the House of Commons yesterday. But what about the people who voted in the referendum? We sent Mark Lebel out with the Daily Politics mood box, a very, very scientific way of judging public opinion in Britain, to find out what people in Bromley made of the High Court ruling.
The High Court has ruled that the UK Parliament should have the final say over triggering Article 50. But the government says it's going to appeal that decision in the Supreme Court. So we've come here to Bromley, where people voted roughly 50-50 to leave or remain, to ask them who they think should decide when the process to leave the EU should begin. Is it Parliament or the PM? Who do you think should decide when the process of leaving the EU should begin? Parliament or the Prime Minister?
I'm going to go for Parliament. It was a nation's decision, so I think a group should decide en masse.
Parliament.
Parliament.
Why? Because they represent a high proportion of the country.
There's more of them, so more opinions.
I don't think it will be a deal if Parliament decides.
Really? You think they'll stop it?
Yes, I think underneath there are certain things going on that they want to prolong it as long as possible, hoping everybody will change their mind. We can't live in this uncertainty for much longer.
As many people as possible, I would say.
So that would suggest Parliament.
Prime Minister. Yeah, same. I agree.
Why? Why not Parliament?
Because the Prime Minister's in charge of the country. For a reason.
I think the PM.
That's an easy one.
Easy one?
Parliament.
Why is that easy?
Well, they fought for sovereignty and they've got it.
What does that mean about sovereignty if unelected judges have passed it back to politicians to take control of?
Well, they've passed it back to the elected officials to judge.
So unelected people have passed it back to elected people?
Well, I think that says something ludicrous about the system, doesn't it?
We're about halfway through, and so far people want Parliament to make the decision.
Prime Minister is the head of the Parliament, and yeah, that's why she was put in place in the first place. So yeah, that's what I think.
Parliament or the Prime Minister?
Parliament.
Tricky one. I guess the Prime Minister.
Parliament.
Hey, what was that?
I know, yeah.
Anyone?
Parliament.
No. Oh, you just voted for Parliament.
I know I did.
I thought you wanted to vote for her, Theresa May.
Changed my mind at the last minute.
Parliament or Theresa May?
It's so hard to answer that question. I don't have an answer to that question because I don't think we have anyone in control who's actually has the idea or their hearts open to the idea that we're all brothers and sisters on this earth.
So, when faced with the choice, the people of Bromley think that Parliament should decide when the process of leaving the EU should begin. Well, that's what a few people told us anyway.
Mark Lebel with his balls. I told you it was scientific. We've been joined from Cardiff by the Labour MP Owen Smith, who challenged Jeremy Corbyn for the Labour leadership over the summer. Welcome to the Daily Politics, Owen Smith.
Good to be back.
Yeah, we haven't seen you for a while. If the government has to come forward not just with a motion to trigger Brexit, but with an act of Parliament which may contain some of the positions it intends to take in the negotiations, would you seek to amend these conditions?
Well, I'd seek to amend it so as to be certain that we've got the fullest possible explanation from the government as to what their vision is for a post-Brexit world, what they want to try and achieve. And I've also said that I think that's another opportunity for us to either see whether there is a further parliamentary vote at the end of the process such that we can once more ratify it, or indeed potentially a second referendum in which the people of Britain, in another active democracy, could determine whether they want to finally ratify what we're actually going to have, as opposed to what we were promised back in June.
That's a little bit down the road yet. I'll come to that in a minute. Let me stick with this process, with the Parliament's role in determining the government's negotiating position. Would you seek to make it a negotiating position with you and your like-minded colleagues that the government should attempt to remain a member of the single market?
That would definitely be one of the things I would like to see as a red line in our negotiation. And therefore that is absolutely one of the things that I think ought to be stipulated by Parliament as one of the conditions on the government in going into the negotiation. Now, they may not agree with that, of course, but that is my view, and that's what I try and achieve.
So, and I'm grateful for you clarifying that. Do you understand that's why people on the other side believe that this is a way of really watering down the result on June the 23rd, because it follows that if we remain a member of the single market, we remain under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and we are subject to the freedom of movement rules. So this is really a way of undermining the decision taken on June the 23rd. You understand that, don't you?
I do understand that, and I think the answer to that, Andrew, honestly, is potentially some of those things could apply, but we're going into completely uncharted territory. 2 years of open-ended negotiation with European partners who themselves are going through, as you will know, elections next May and next September. I think there are many moving parts in this machine and all sorts of possible outputs from the machine, and we need, I think, to be clear from the government as to what they think the red lines are. And
no, but I'm trying to be clear
what
what your red lines are, because it looks.
Well, I think we should stay within the European Union.
Yeah, I know
also
that.
think
You
we
lost
should
that
stay
argument.
within the
So I'm trying to work out how you plan to undermine it. Having lost it, I'm trying to work out how you want to undermine it. Do you want to see would you try to get amendments that the government's negotiating position should put very limited curbs on free movement as much more as important, so that we remain a member of the single market? Would you want to see that as its position?
Well, I would definitely want to reflect what I think is actually, if you look at the polls, majority opinion in Britain, which is the economic circumstances are more important and the economic outcomes than controlling immigration. That's certainly what repeated polls have shown. I mean, and that means staying within the single market. And I would like to see the government being clear as to whether they think staying within the single market and getting the best economic terms for Britain, or controlling immigration from within the EU, which one of those two binary choices, if you like, is the most important red line for them? I think it should be single market.
People watching this will see, if you want the government's negotiating position to be to remain a member of the single market, I emphasise the word member, to remain a member of the customs union and not to do much to control free movement of peoples within the single market, that is tantamount to reversing the decision this country voted for on June the 23rd.
Well, you say that, Andrew. I'm not sure that's true, because I don't think. Well, a lot of it is wrong. I don't think the membership of the single market was on the ballot paper. I think it was a very simple, do you want to leave or stay within the European Union? The fundamental point that I made all summer, and I continue to make, is that we weren't given clarity from either side of the campaign, frankly, but certainly from the Brexit side of the campaign, as to what the real red lines were and what the real outcomes were. In fact, we were told a load of lies about the prospect of more money for the NHS, none of which was true.
Because David Cameron was explicit that we would leave the single market if we voted to leave. George Osborne was explicit on that. Boris Johnson was explicit that we would leave the single market. Michael Gove was explicit. I mean, what bit didn't you understand, that if we leave the European Union, we cease to be members, different from access, of the European Union?
Andrew, with respect, I think that is slightly unfair, a bit of revisionism. What you've just highlighted were lots of people, apart from Michael Gove, who were campaigning on the Remain side of the equation. Many people on the Brexit side of the equation fudged that, or indeed went much further. I remember Daniel Hannan being interviewed, I think, on your programme, and saying that this wasn't about necessarily leaving the single market. So we were left tantalisingly wondering whether this was going to mean big controls on immigration. Was it going to mean we were going to leave the single market? The customs union, I don't remember being discussed at any point during the entire period of the referendum. We were in the dark as to what the real output was going to be, and we still are. And the simple point that I and many of my colleagues are making across the House is it's the job of Parliament to scrutinise the government. This is the most important decision we've taken economically, culturally, arguably in my lifetime. And I think it's our job to scrutinise it. And if like me, you still believe that we are better off within the European Union, then we should be allowed to continue to make that argument.
If the government comes forward with a motion to ratify Article 50, but not with the negotiating position of which you would approve, will you vote against Article 50?
Potentially, yes.
Can you tell us, that is your position and you've just been very clear there, can you tell us what the Labour Party's position is?
No, I think the Labour Party's position, as I've seen it so far, is that they too are going to wait and see. We're going to wait collectively and see what the government come forward with and then make a judgment. But my impression, hearing colleagues talking, is that most colleagues feel that we couldn't possibly do anything other than trigger Article 50. I disagree with them, and I think that if we have if we've got a very limited view from the government as to what triggering Article 50 is going to mean for the country, if we've got a one-line bill that is designed to minimise and mitigate against scrutiny, and if we have no further clarity as to whether Britain is going to be better or worse off as a result of the ending of the negotiations, then I think the right thing for me to do on behalf of my constituents is not to vote to make them worse off.
How much do you fear that if Parliament is seen to thwart the government's strategy for the Brexit negotiations, that the government simply calls an election early next year and Labour faces a wipeout in the north of England?
Well, they might choose to do that, call an election, that is, and if they do, good, because I think we need to see the back of this Tory government.
You don't think that's going to happen, though, do you?
I'm not entirely convinced it's going to happen, no. You might have seen what I said during the summer. I was slightly sceptical about our prospects of booting them out right now. But I don't think it'll be the only issue on which people vote. I think people are very sensible in this country. I trust the British people to make sensible decisions, but I think they need the full facts before them. And my contention throughout the referendum debate and since is that they weren't given the full facts, and we need to see the full facts before we have a final say.
We're going down the say. I've got one very quick question for you, which I hope I need a quick answer. If you have the opportunity, because there will be a chance to amend the Article 50 legislation, would you attempt to insert into that a second referendum, which is the policy you stood on in the Labour Party once the negotiations are over?
Yes, I will.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Owen Smith speaking to us there from Wales. We're now joined in the studio by the former Cabinet Minister, leading Leave campaigner, Ian Duncan Smith. Ian Duncan Smith, what is wrong with the judges of the High Court saying that the people, the referendum they understand, but the manner in which the process now takes place has to be approved by Parliament?
Well, I wrote a piece about this today to say that actually I think this is a wider issue than Article 50. I think we are in the middle of a battle between the courts and Parliament. Whether or not you agree about the Article 50 point, the real problem here is that it is not, in my view, and in the view of many constitutional lawyers, the position of the courts to rule on procedures in Parliament and how Parliament goes about its business. Parliament can call the government in at any time it likes. It can hold any number of debates. It was made clear at the time that the 72 Act will have to be repealed. That means that there will be legislation in the House absolutely locked to the Article 50 process. So all of this is already what the government has said they will do. And what the courts have done is they have said, no, they know better than this. They know now, and they direct Parliament, that the use of the executive power now can only be used in regard to this triggering of Article 50 by legislation in the House of Commons. Now that is stepping beyond a line they have ever crossed before, and that is about them putting themselves above the democratic elected.
But what is wrong with the government laying before Parliament its decision to trigger Article 50 and give a broad outline of how it intends to deliver on Brexit? What would be wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that, and they can do it any time they like.
So why argue with the courts?
No, what is wrong about this is actually what the courts have said, is that they cannot trigger Article 50 without the permission of the Commons, and then also the Lords, because it's Parliament they're talking about now. The problem with this is that actually this flies in the face of what happened when we passed the referendum bill. This was a sovereign act of Parliament that handed back to the British people the sovereign right to make the decision about whether we stayed in or we left. This is not about discussing terms of what happens. All this is about triggering Article 50. You have to trigger Article 50 to start the process of leaving. So this is the question about, can the government say we are triggering Article 50? Not can the government say what we will negotiate, it's can the government say we now trigger Article 50? The British people made that decision. All the government is meant to do now is decide at what point they trigger it. They can debate everything else after that. Parliament will do that, but not the decision to trigger Article 50. That has been made.
But why?
It's just a case of timing.
I understand that the referendum result gave the government a mandate to trigger Article 50. I'd appreciate that. But why should Parliament vote for a blank cheque? As Owen Smith was saying, it's not exactly clear what basis we will leave the EU, and therefore is it not the job of Parliament to hold the government's feet to the fire to say we need to know in triggering Article 50 what you are intending to do, to give us an idea of what life outside the EU will be like?
Yes, and that can go on, and that will be ad nauseum. There will be endless debates about that. They could call a debate on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday in the House of Commons. We can have 2 days of debates. The government will give way and give debates. That's not the issue.
But the issue isn't debates. The issue is legislation whereby
but that is going to
we
go to the
can
House.
lay down
But
what
Andrew,
the conditions will be.
This is converging two issues, and they shouldn't be. They need to be separated. Triggering of Article 50, the decision has been made. It was made by the British people. They had the sovereign right to make it. This is not about the decision to trigger Article 50. This is therefore now confused by Owen Smith about what then is the government's negotiating position. That's a wholly different argument. And the Parliament has the right to know about that and discuss it. I don't have a problem with that. That is exactly the point. The government has said by the end of that they will have a vote. You know, the 72 Act covers every single aspect of our membership of the European Union. That can be amended to hell
Let me ask you this.
by the Lords and by the Commons. That will be the case.
But David Davis has said that it now looks like the government will have to bring forward an Act of Parliament. And I would suggest to you that the Act of Parliament will be more than just a motion to trigger Article 50. They will have to say more than that. If that becomes a wrangle in Parliament, if that becomes, as Owen Smith and others will try to amend and change and all the rest of it, does that make the prospect of an early election more likely?
Well, this is obviously a decision that finally the government has to make, although I have to say the Constitution, as we reset it, which I was never much in favour of, means that becomes...
Well, Labour would have to vote for it.
It becomes more difficult, so I don't know about that. My simple point is two things on what you just said. The first is, I'm not absolutely convinced anyway, even if the Supreme Court comes back and upholds this decision, that you need legislation in that sense. It is feasible to have a vote on this if that is what because remember, the courts have not said and cannot say you must legislate.
No, the court did not say what we should vote on.
Exactly right, and nor can they. So it could be for Parliament to have a vote. Shall we trigger, shall the government have the power to trigger Article 50, yes or no?
You could win that vote.
Well, maybe. My point, though, is the reason I argue this is because I think there's a wider issue here.
I understand.
And the second point about the general election is, of course, if, and this is really what the issue's about, and you got to it with Owen Smith quite well, I thought, you made the point that his whole purpose in life is not to accept the decision of the British people and to slow it down and stop it. That's the reality of it. If it gets to that point with legislation, then I think that is when you start thinking about whether a new mandate is required.
Where is this going for the government?
Oh, yes, chaos. I mean, you hear the country's divided more than ever. You watched Question Time last night. There was sheer divide between the inners and outers. And it's interesting to hear Owen Smith talking about revisionism, because that is what, this verdict yesterday has let all those people back in. Owen Smith, Nick Clegg, all those people who were shouting on the sidelines, wanting a say, they're now in.
So what do you think will the government do?
I think if it's primary legislation, I can't see how they avoid a general election. If it goes down that route and all the amendments pile in, I cannot see how they avoid that.
But is that right? I mean, if you look at the arithmetic there, I was looking at some of the figures. There will be some Tory rebels, but maybe not a huge number that would actually defy the government in the end. A lot of Labour, plus the government can count on the DUP, so its majority is about 23 in an issue like this at least. A lot of Labour MPs, Owen Smith notwithstanding, particularly in the north, will be very reluctant to do anything to derail this.
We're talking about niche arguments. Owen Smith in Parliament at the moment is making a niche argument. There simply isn't the appetite to not vote to trigger Article 50. That in itself, I don't think, comes under question. Northern MPs, Labour MPs, so many of them may have passionately campaigned for Remain. They saw what happened in their own constituencies. They wouldn't do that to themselves. But, and this is where I disagree with Ian, actually the question is simply about whether or not there is something further in this that will allow MPs to have a say on what Brexit looks like.
There's
and
plenty
that
of scope
is
to
where...
do that. I'm sorry, there's plenty of scope to do that. The trouble is there's a lot of ignorance around about the workings of Parliament. The passing of the getting rid of the 72 Act gives you absolute scope. It is a full act. It will go all the way through both houses. You can amend everything in it. It applies all European law. It also then will have to disapply it. Everything is in that.
But that would be a nightmare for the government.
But that is already what they are doing.
That would make Maastricht look like a holiday.
Well, my point is, and this is why, hold on a second.
Need to worry.
This is why you've just said something completely incorrect. You said the real issue is about what there is in there over the debate. Parliament is going to be debating that ad nauseum. You'll be sick and tired of that in a year's time, writing this up. My point is, this is not about that.
You've got to let me respond.
We need to be very clear.
Yeah.
This is about whether the government has the right, under executive power, to trigger Article 50 in line with the sovereign vote that the British people made. That is why so many constitutional lawyers find this absolutely absurd of the High Court to have stepped across the line and told Parliament how to order its affairs.
On that point, Brexiteers, though I understand why they are suspicious, because parliamentarians were overwhelmingly in favour of Remain, do not need to worry, in my opinion. Parliament will not block a vote on Article 50.
I'm not worrying about that.
And the thing you will need to worry about, in whatever form it takes, whether, as you're suggesting, or perhaps somehow linked to this, is whether, in fact, they want to debate on something that might look like Remain through the back door. For example, the issue on the single market or the issue on the customs union.
That is going to happen.
But Anushka, in today's Guardian, Polly Toynbee is saying MPs should ignore constituents and vote in the national interest.
But I don't think MPs
Brexit.
are going to do that.
I know, but that's what people are fearing. This is what they
But
think
the
is going to
Lords,
happen.
and here's the point, can I just make this point? This is really what she's talking about. She's talking to the Lords. And the truth is, we know in the House of Lords, and now you've already heard members of the House of Lords saying they have a duty to ignore and defy that vote. And they want to do it over Article 50's triggering. They don't want to mess around in the midst of it. They really want to stop Article 50. So that's my point, why the courts stepping into this have actually stepped across the line and put Parliament in a constitutional crisis with the British people. Right. The people had the sovereign right, and now we're defying that.
But also remember...
No, I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop, and there we've got to move on. And we'll be, once we get the American election out of the way, we'll come back to this.
No one will care about this then.
Ian Duncan, well, they will after next Tuesday. Ian Duncan Smith, thanks for that. A lot more questions still to answer on this as we move into uncharted territory.
If you thought it was all over on referendum day, it has turned out that it was really only the beginning and that we've absolutely no idea what lies ahead. The country was divided then, and now the High Court has decided that the terms of Brexit will be fought over on the floor of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But how will MPs and peers, of course, exercise the power the judges have given them? Will they dare to get in the way of the will of the people? And will yesterday's historic judgment lead to anything more than a lot more talk and chaos? Here's David Grossman.
What started off as a straight binary choice, remain or leave, has sprouted into a mass of tangled branches, leading to multiple versions of Brexit and different ways of getting there. Fortunately today we could get some clarity on what was going on from none other than the Foreign Secretary.
Ich bin nicht ein Berliner. Aber meine Frau ist eine Berlinerin, weil sie in Berlin geboren wurde. How about that? There you go.
When he actually got down to speaking about Brexit, Mr Johnson explained that the High Court's judgment yesterday needn't delay the government's aim of triggering Article 50 by the end of March next year.
It's very important to recognise that the British people voted to leave the European Union, leave the treaties of the European Union, and that is what we are going to get on and do. And no, I do not think that it will, to answer a question you didn't in fact ask, but no, I don't think it will interfere with the timetable for that process.
Right now, the government's focusing on overturning the High Court's judgment from yesterday that Parliament must trigger Article 50 through legislation.
One of those familiar with the government's case told me it's not necessary for the Supreme Court to overturn entirely the original judgment. What they would like to happen is for the judges to define more clearly and more narrowly the role of Parliament in triggering Article 50.
It would help the government if the Supreme Court said Parliament could pass a resolution rather than full legislation. Why? Well, even the shortest bill would be amendable. That could potentially tie the government up in knots for months. And then it has to get through the Lords, even more pro-Remain than the Commons, and the Lords could delay it for up to a year.
In the House of Lords, the government doesn't have a majority and it has no control over the time of the Lords, so the Lords can take as long as they like. In the House of Commons, the government could introduce a timetabling motion, which it often does for bills, but it needs a majority to get that timetabling motion passed. And the difficulty the government may face is that there may be rebels on both sides of the argument, some Brexiteers and some Remainers, who want a fuller discussion and therefore are unwilling to support the government in maintaining a very tight timetable.
And political passions are certainly running hot right now. Today, a Conservative MP, Stephen Phillips, resigned his seat. Such was, he said, his fundamental disagreement with the way Theresa May is pursuing Brexit. And Labour is certainly not promising to come to the government's aid.
Well, this issue should never have ended up in the courts. The government should accept that Parliament has a role to play, and everyone should calm down and realise that the majority of voters and the majority of constituencies voted to leave, and therefore the majority of MPs will vote to trigger Article 50. The more important questions that need to be addressed are about the future of Britain's relationship with the European Union, which will affect jobs, livelihoods and the value of the pound in people's pockets.
Unless the government is very careful, it might find its parliamentary options disappear faster than autumn leaves.
David Grossman. Well, Dominic Grieve is the former Attorney General for England and Wales and a leading Remainer, and Suzanne Evans is a candidate for the UKIP leadership. Good evening to you both. First of all, Dominic Grieve, if the Supreme Court, where the government wants to put it, is appealing, judges that there could be a one-line bill giving the government power to trigger Article 50, would you vote against that?
I've always made quite clear that I think the decision that was taken by the electorate on the 23rd of June must be respected, and I think that applies to virtually every parliamentarian. This is about process. I was horrified at the newspaper coverage, which reminded me of Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe this morning. The judges did exactly what was asked of them. They highlighted that our constitution does not allow you to overturn statute law by decree, which is so well established in this country.
If the Supreme Court judged that a one-line bill by the government to say, give us the power to trigger Article 50, would you vote against that?
What I will do, if we get a bill, which I think is what we need, is we will debate all the issues around that bill, and we will make sure that there is a full understanding by the public and the government as to how we will carry Brexit out.
But what could the government put in that bill that would satisfy you, that wouldn't bind their hands in the negotiation, and would still be in the national interest? It wouldn't be against the national interest, because remember, they don't want to show their hand.
I fully appreciate the government doesn't want to show its hand, but its hand is its fallback positions. Its opening negotiated stance is a matter that's going to come out into the public domain the moment they go to Brussels. So actually debating in Parliament and having parliamentary endorsement for the line they're going to take strengthens the government's case.
Anyway, let me just...
doesn't reduce it at all. The government should be using Parliament as its prop. That is how successful government in the United Kingdom is conducted.
Well, Suzanne Evans, that's exactly what you wanted. You wanted sovereignty returned, British sovereignty returned to the Parliament. You wanted decisions to go through the British Parliament. That's exactly what's happening here.
I think it's very interesting that Mr Grieve wouldn't answer your question about how he was going to vote in Parliament, which I find absolutely amazing. Dominic, you know, you voted for this referendum. You back a government that has said it would implement what the people decided in the referendum, and now you're reneging on what you actually promised. And the thing is, you know, to most people out there who don't understand the legal arguments, this sounds like an establishment stitch-up, which is what we on the Leave side have long suspected, that there is going to be an establishment campaign to try and frustrate Brexit and ultimately try and keep us in the European Union, which I suspect is what you would still like to happen.
I have to say, I think this is pure paranoia. What the Brexiters can't accept is that the consequence of the 23rd of June leaves open a whole range of options which need to be considered and understood in triggering Article 50. And that is the debate that we need to have. I repeat what I said at the very beginning. I respect the decision, and it is Parliament's duty, from my point of view, to try to seek to give effect to what the electorate wants. But we also have to do something else, which is to safeguard the economic well-being and quality of life of people in this country, which is a fundamental conscience requirement on me as a politician. I intend to reconcile the two.
Let's say something along those lines goes forward to the House of Lords, the unelected House of Lords, peers like Alan Sugar, Michelle Moon, all sorts of people, unelected, and they stall and they put amendments in. Surely, given that we've had a referendum, to have a bunch of unelected peers getting in the way of the people's will would be unacceptable.
I think it would, yes. I agree with you entirely. I think that if the Lords were to seek to prevent Article 50 being triggered, I would regard that as unacceptable in the context of the referendum.
If they were to delay it to put in amendments that, for example, perhaps you couldn't get through in the Commons, if they were to delay it to put in amendments like free movement of people or access to the single market, on that level, would that be acceptable to you?
The Lords has a scrutiny role and is entitled to look carefully at how Brexit is going to be carried out. That's their job. Our job in the Commons is similar, although slightly different, because we're directly answerable to our electorate.
Well, Suzanne,
but
let me just put this to
should
Suzanne.
lead to the correct outcome. Debate helps outcomes, suppressing it destroys it.
This is about the whole constitution, isn't it?
It's a constitutional crisis, potentially. But it's also a democratic crisis.
Why is it a crisis? Because actually, why would the judges have acted? We won't go over that just now. But the judges have given an independent ruling in this. It is fair to say and true to say that the public voted for Brexit, but they didn't know the shape of Brexit. Now it might be saying it might be.
I completely dispute
Well,
that.
they didn't know.
Well, you knew exactly what it was, and we had Project Fear, which was trying to make out it was.
Is it a customs union? Is it a free market? Is it free movement of people?
It's leaving the customs union. It's leaving the single market. Both David Cameron and George Osborne made that very, very clear. You might remember in the course of the referendum campaign, the whole issue about the single market came to the fore.
But the Conservatives in the manifesto put that they actually wanted still to have access to the single market.
Well, everyone has access to the country. Kirsty, just about every country in the world has access to the single market.
But the point is that people do not know what they're getting. And
people know exactly what they're getting.
People know what they're getting?
They voted to leave the European Union.
I disagree entirely. People voted for a question and answered that question. They wished to have a relationship with the EU from outside of it.
You voted for that question, Mr. Grieve. But if you weren't happy with the question, what were you doing voting for it?
The question did not go into the details of what the relationship is that we should have with the European Union once we've left it. And that is of massive importance. It's perfectly obvious it's of massive importance. You only have to look at the currency fluctuations that take place on a daily basis, depending on what people think the outcome of that might be.
Can I just say we've already had Nick Clegg, threatening to vote against. We've had Owen Smith talking about the possibility of another referendum. We've had Ken Clarke saying you're going to vote against. Is it possible that against the will of the people, the House of Commons could vote against this bill?
Of course, it's possible that the House of Commons could vote against the bill.
Would it be unacceptable to you?
In my view, for my mind, there is no basis on which I could not implement what the people have asked for in June by a majority.
If the government gets knocked back by the Supreme Court, should it take its appeal to the European Court of Justice?
No. I think what government should do is repeal the 1972 Communities Act forthwith. Then they have a binary choice. MPs have an option. A yes, no. Do we accept the will of the British people and leave, or do we not?
But you see that?
And if you don't vote to leave, then I'm afraid, UKIP is going to be snapping at your heels.
If I may say so, that precisely illustrates that is an unlawful act.
How can it be unlawful?
It is utterly unlawful to leave the European Union by merely repealing the 72.
Thank you very much.
Well,
I'm going to have to stop you there.